The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Yaron Brook Show on this, what is it? I can't even keep track. Tuesday night. All the days blurred into one now that we're in, lockdown, isolation in our homes. It all looks the same. Anyway, I was going to do a show yesterday, and I got up in the morning and wasn't feeling well. I ended up, convincing myself I had coronavirus, measuring my temperature all day. It never really went up much. Anyway, by the evening, I was feeling much better. So I hope that was my bout with coronavirus, and I'm done. And I've got the antibodies all through my body now, and I'm immune to the disease. Of course, if we had a sane testing protocol, I would just go somewhere, get tested, and know one way or the other. But of course, I'd have to be half dead in order to get tested, for coronavirus. So who knows? I guess when we have the serum tests and we'll be able to test after the fact. I like that. Coronachondria. That's right. Hypochondria is applied to coronavirus. Coronachondria. That's great. So I'm looking forward to the serum test to be able to test, whether at any point I had coronavirus, and then I can speculate when that point actually happened. But it would be nice to have it, get it over with, and move on. Which reminds me that I wanted, before we get to the main topic, which is kind of America 2.0 and where I see things post coronavirus. I guess 2.0 is a term coined by Mark Cuban about the post coronavirus world. So I want to talk about the post coronavirus world. But before I do that, I'd like to talk about this. Just a little thing that kind of ticks me off constantly not constantly, in the last few days, talking about coronavirus. And that is the seeming inability of people to deal with probabilities, to deal with statistics, to deal with just probabilistic thinking. So this is the example, right? So I have said over and over and over again that the likelihood of hospitalization and the likelihood of death is significantly greater if you're old. And I've given some statistics, and I don't have them in front of me, but I've given statistics that if you get coronavirus and you're over the age of 75, your probability to die, first of all, your probability to be hospitalized, based on numbers I've seen coming out of New York, is about 50%. And then your probability to die is, about 15%. So 15 out of every 100 people who are over the age of 75 who get coronavirus are dying. Again, the specific numbers I'm saying might not be true. And of course, we don't know how many people actually have it, and we don't know, because we're not testing. So all these death statistics are not clear. So I'm just using this as an example. Clearly the probability as you get younger declines, and it declines significantly, of death. So once you get around 40, the probability of death is significantly lower. And if you get into the teens, and if you get, teenagers and young children, the probability of dying is something like, and again, my point here is not the specific numbers I'm quoting, but the principle, is something like 1 in 10,000. So it's very, 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 very rare for somebody to die who's very young. Now, there are complicating factors. I've also said if you have certain pre-existing conditions. Now, it's true, the list of pre-existing conditions is pretty long, and a lot of people have pre-existing conditions. But the fact is that if you have pre-existing conditions, the probability that you will die goes up. So I make this claim, and people come back to me with, but young people are dying. And the answer is yes. But the probability of young people dying is low. And when you make decisions in life, you make decisions, partially, not all decisions, but based on probability of outcome. So you have to think about probabilities. If the probability of an outcome, for example, flying in an airplane, if the probability of dying in an airplane crash is basically so small as to be equivalent to zero, but not quite zero, because some people do die in air crashes, you go in an airplane, you don't worry, you fly around. The probability of dying in a car accident is much higher than it is in an airplane crash. But it's so small, you don't think about it. But there's certain activities, I don't know. Let's assume this is true of skydiving, because I obviously haven't prepped my examples of risky behavior. Probability of skydiving is, 1%. Well, that's 1 in 100 die. I don't think it's that high, but let's say that was high. Well, now that really causes me to think about whether I want to go skydiving or not. It's something to think about. Now, if the probability was 15%, oh my God, I'm not doing it. No way am I taking a 15% chance of dying. Now, it's still true that some people die in car accidents and some people die in airplane crashes, but it's such a low probability, it doesn't change your behavior. Whereas if there was an activity where 15% of people died, it would change your behavior, should change your behavior. That is true in all of the things we do in life. We don't know, it's very rare that we know with certainty what will happen in the future. Right? So most of our decisions about the future are to some extent or another probabilistic. What is likely to happen? What is the likely outcome? Now, the likely outcome doesn't always happen. That's why it's likely, not certain. So pointing out that some people do indeed die in a plane accident doesn't change the fact that the chances of you dying in a plane accident when you get on this particular plane are statistically as close to zero as one can get. Somebody says that the probability of skydiving is 0.0007%. I don't know if he made it up or if that's true. But here, the probability of dying climbing the Everest is 6.5%. In other words, 6.5%, all else held constant, because I'm sure there are issues of age and pre-existing conditions and lots of other things, but all else held constants, the probability of climbing Everest is 6.5%. That is a non-trivial percent. It's a good reason not to climb Mount Everest. But if the probability of skydiving, of dying in skydiving, is truly 0.0007%, then that's negligible. It's not significant. I mean, I wouldn't skydive because I'm afraid of heights. Had nothing to do with the risk of dying. So it's really important we get the probabilities down. So what happens when I post this stuff about elderly people and young people and so on, is somebody will say, but young people die. And they'll tell me a whole story about some young person who's dead, and I see this on Facebook all the time, who died, no pre-existing condition, and it's very sad. And nobody knows why they died. But of course, that is completely to be expected. If you look at the probabilities, there's a certain probability that somebody very young with no pre-existing condition will die. But the probability is very, very low. Now, it's not to say there's no reason for them dying, and unfortunately we don't understand the reason how the virus works, but it's just that's the probability. So anecdotes, as horrific as they may be, do not disprove the principle. Do not disprove the fact of probabilities. And probabilities matter. If coronavirus affected everybody the way it affects teenagers, we wouldn't be talking about it. We wouldn't care about coronavirus. even though some people would still be dying. But the death rate would be so low that no change in behavior would be justified. It's because some people within the population are dying at rates of 1, 5, 10, maybe even 15%, that we are scared and we are motivated to change our behavior. So again, probabilities matter. How high the probability matters. You can't think about life, you can't think about the future you can't think about risk based on anecdotes. You have to think about risk, in terms of probabilities. The probability a good outcome versus a bad outcome will occur. And you have to weigh them. Just like you do, not exactly, because you can't live your life exactly like this. And the probability, I was just going to say just like in poker. But you can't actually do it like in poker, because in poker the probabilities are actually known. If you've got a very mathematical mind and you see a hand and you know what's on the table, you can tell with a high degree of likelihood what are the chances of you winning a particular hand. And the same in life. But if you undercut that rationality, that assessment of actual outcomes, of the probability of something happen and not something else, and you overload it with basically fear-mongering through anecdotes, then that is unhelpful. Now somebody says, nurses and doctors have died. Sure. How many of those nurses and doctors, what were the ages? 1, 2. Did they have pre-existing conditions? And 3, most important is, what was the viral load? It seems like, I shouldn't say without doubt, but it seems like the amount of virus you're exposed to will determine to some extent how severe the case you're going to get. Now, none of that is being proved, but that is what people suspect. And the doctors and nurses have been exposed to high doses even when they're young. And even when you're young, if you're exposed to high doses of it, you might get sick. But again, all of that goes into assessing the probabilities. And one of the things one would say is, for a doctor and nurse who are exposed to the virus constantly, the probabilities are higher that they will get sick and potentially die from this. So, again, the fact that doctors and nurses are dying doesn't change the fact. It just adds more information. It changes the probability assessment given your job, given your exposure to the virus, given what you do. But again, the probabilities affect choices we make. Probabilities affect our behavior. Probabilities are what it means, assessing the likelihood of things, and what it means to plan and act towards a future. And you cannot base your actions on low probability, rare events that you might have an anecdote for. So stop posting anecdotes. They're unhelpful. All they do is fearmonger. All they do is create fear in people because they think the anecdote is representative, when the numbers suggest, the actual data suggests, that they are not. Somebody's saying, can I have a medical profession? I've had Amesh Adalja on the show a few times, a couple of times. And I'm trying to get him again, but he's so busy, it's hard to schedule him. So, but I speak to him, and I've been in conference call with Amesh to kind of get updated on his thinking about it. So hopefully he has impacted the way I think about these things. But again, this particular issue is not relevant. It's not relevant to be a medical doctor or anything else. The question is, do you know how to assess data? Do you know how to evaluate data? And, it's what I do for a living is analyze. That's what finance is. It's all about assessing data and making predictions about the future based on probabilities, based on likely and unlikely outcomes. All right, so it's really, really important not to get caught up in the anecdotes and to respect the data, respect the science, respect the numbers, and base your behavior on actual data, on actual facts, on actual probabilities. Probabilities are facts. Right. All right, let's see. We've got a bunch of super chat questions, but I want to cover the second topic first. Let me just see if there's anything relevant. Okay. Let's do America 2.0, right? Okay. So what happens after this crisis is over is the question. What does America look like once coronavirus is gone? And to put this in context, we've had two dramatic events over the last 20 years that can give us a hint with regard to what the world looks like post-dramatic event. And the two dramatic events I'm thinking of are 9/11 in 2001 and the 2008 financial crisis. Two dramatic events that arguably changed America. Changed our laws, changed our behavior, changed our attitudes, changed our perspective. And in both cases, we are still living their outcome. We're still living the consequences. And arguably, in both cases, we misidentified the problem, misdiagnosed the issue, came to the wrong conclusions, changed our behavior in wrong, destructive ways that have changed America, I think, generally for the worst. And the question is, will the same thing happen to us as a consequence of the coronavirus and the lockdown? And this is motivated by a question I got from David Strasberg. And he sent a list of questions, and I'm going to go through those questions. But first, I want to remind you of kind of what happened post 9/11 and what happened post 2008 to give you a sense of how this works. So obviously, post 9/11, we made we didn't make Islam. We made terrorism the biggest threat to American security there is, at the expense of really all other threats. And one could argue that, to some extent, our lack of preparedness for a pandemic is partially caused by the fact that our foreign policy is single-mindedly focused on terrorism, on Islamic terrorism. Now, it's a little scary because, imagine if the terrorists had used biological weapons. We are pathetically ill-equipped and unready to deal with it, as this coronavirus has illustrated, right? So let's hope they don't learn the lesson, or let's hope we learn how to deal with it in the future. But 9/11, we misidentified the problem. The problem was terrorism. We refused to name the enemy, Islamic totalitarianism. We launched into meaningless wars where thousands of American young men died, and well over $1 trillion, or maybe much more than $1 trillion, were completely and utterly squandered. We, for a while, squashed the terrorism against us, but didn't destroy the terrorists or their infrastructure. And there was a long period of time where the terrorism struck a little bit in the United States, but a lot in Europe. That too seems to have been squashed. By the way, as I predicted, I said over and over again that the problem of terrorism in Europe is the existence and the thriving of ISIS. And once you got rid of ISIS, the terrorism would go away. And everybody, I remember all the people on the chat and all the people in Facebook saying, oh, what are you talking about? You know, the problem is the Muslims in Europe, and the Muslims in Europe will always commit terrorism. ISIS has nothing to do with it. You can't defeat the Muslims in Europe by defeating ISIS. But we have, right? By defeating ISIS, nobody, as I said at the time, nobody actually wants to die and commit a suicide bombing, a suicide mission on behalf of a losing ideology. And if you show them it's a losing ideology, terrorism plummets, and it has. But I don't expect anybody to pat me on the back and say, Yaron, you were right again, we were all wrong. Particularly not the people at the time who claimed to be wrong. But they were wrong. I was right. Again. 9/11 also brought with us not only the wrong wars, the misidentification of the problem, the misidentification of the enemy, but it's also brought us, as a consequence of all that, a massive surveillance state. It brought us the NSA. It brought us everything that Snowden revealed, and nothing has changed since then. It brought us secret courts to America, secret FBI warrants, secret listening in and collecting data and specific data, mass data, all kinds of data that the NSA and other intelligence elements are gaining against us. And we all don't care. It also bought us the TSA. Think about, those of you vaguely remember, think about pre and post 9/11, what it was like going to the airport. You remember going to the gate with your guests? You remember meeting people at the gate? The pre-post 9/11 security, the pre-post 9/11 TSA, it brought us a massive government bureaucracy that is dedicated to harassing us at the airport in the name of security and safety. And nobody remembers what it was like before, and nobody seems to care anymore about TSA. TSA is like a metaphysical reality. It's unchallenged. Nobody cares. Nobody cares one iota about them. You remember George Bush created the largest restructuring of government and the growth of the Homeland Security, which is responsible for a million things. Massive government bureaucracy. Nobody cares. Post 9/11, we started spending money like there was no tomorrow. Nobody cared. Nobody cares today. So 9/11, government grew. Government power over our lives through surveillance grew. Government power over our lives through our behavior at airports grew. And the government engaged in what turned out to be mass sacrifice of American troops for nothing in its wars overseas. And the problem of terrorism, by the way, has not gone away. It's just in a lull. There will be the right time when it comes back. So that's post 9/11. America changed. Americans before 9/11 wouldn't have tolerated a TSA like this. There was some consciousness about government spending. There was some care about how American troops were used. There was certainly a concern about spying. All of that is gone, and the government can basically almost do what it wants in those arenas. After 2008, again, we misdiagnosed the problem. The problem was banks. Too little regulation. Too little controls. And the solution was massive additional regulation, Dodd-Frank. Massive growth in government, stimulus packages, and a massive increase in government spending. Again, nobody cared. and a basic, fundamental shift in Americans' thinking about capitalism. Before 2008, generally capitalism was viewed as a positive and socialism was ridiculed. 2008 launched, really, the popularity of socialism and basically the death in the American minds of capitalism. The last remnant of some kind of support for capitalism was the Tea Party movement. But it was mainly old people. It was mainly, it didn't last, and it didn't have cultural resonance. What had cultural resonance is the anti-capitalist movement, both on the left and on the right, that I've documented on the show over and over again. Both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump and the national conservatism and all the variety of national conservatism that exists out there that basically reject the idea of capitalism. So 2008 really destroyed the concept of capitalism and free markets and cemented the idea that government must have a dramatic, significant, substantial role in our economic lives. So both crises did this. They grew the role of government significantly. And they eroded our commitment to freedom, to individualism, to capitalism, to the American way of life. I mean, I don't know anything good that came out of 9/11. I mean, other than the recognition that Islam and particularly Islamic totalitarianism was a threat in some parts of the culture. I don't know anything good that came out of 9/11, and I know nothing good that came out of 2008. Even though 2008 was caused by government regulation, caused by too big of a government, caused by a Federal Reserve, that didn't stick. That story has no resonance with the American people. So in both cases, the crisis led to bigger government and less freedom. Now, I think, unfortunately, that is going to be the case for coronavirus. I saw an article, I think this is on Politico, where they interviewed 20 cultural figures about what they thought the outcome, well, how will the world change post-coronavirus? And, you know, some of it was pretty innocuous that they mentioned different things. Some of it was ludicrous, like, we'll be less polarized. I mean, there's a sense in which we might be, but I don't think that's what he meant. But I think some of it was quite perceptive and scary. So one said, post-coronavirus, we will be less individualistic. To quote, the coronavirus pandemic marks the end of our romance with market society and hyper-individualism. We could turn towards authoritarianism, the person said. Who's this? This is Eric Kleinberg, some professor of sociology at NYU. But he says, we're now seeing the market-based models for social organization fail catastrophically. A self-seeking behavior makes this crisis so much more dangerous than it needed to be. We will reorient our politics and make substantial new investments in public goods, for health especially, and for public services. So I think he's absolutely right, for the wrong reasons. He views this as a positive. I view it as a negative. But yes, I think one of the consequences of this is a further rejection of markets, further rejection of individualism, a greater reliance on government, a greater demand for government to take over healthcare, and for greater public services, and a recognition coming out of the stimulus plan and the lockdowns that our economy cannot function without a government writing $2 trillion checks that the only way to survive the lockdown, which of course was necessary, they will claim, was for the government to step in and write those checks. And in a laissez-faire capitalist economy, if you'd had lockdowns, who is going to write the checks? Who is going to pay these people? They're all going to starve. That's going to be the story. So we need government in emergencies. And by the way, they will tell us, and some of the people mention this in some of these others' commentaries, there are other crises that we need a government now that are just as bad as coronavirus, we will be told. For example, the obvious one is climate change. Climate change cannot be solved by markets, cannot be solved by individuals, cannot be solved. It can only be solved by the state. And climate change has the potential to kill many more people, we will be told, than coronavirus, and therefore the state must intervene. And if it has to shut down whole industries, well, so what? We already shut down whole industries. We'll just write big, fat stimulus checks, and that'll solve the problem. Or, for example, there is another crisis that makes coronavirus much worse. And indeed, not just coronavirus, but actually makes climate change much worse, or the response to climate change much worse. It creates all of our problems much worse, and that's inequality. And there is indeed no way to deal with inequality unless the government takes it on and deals with it. So we need the government to intervene in markets, and if necessary, to write trillion-dollar checks so that we can deal with this crisis of inequality. Why won't this paste? There we go. All right, I don't know what happened there. And you can imagine on and on and on. The left will come up with every crisis possible, and the right will do the same. Crisis of the family, crisis of abortion, crisis of this, crisis of that. Uniform to most of these people is the belief that we need much more government intervention in healthcare. So you get demands, they expect to see public demands for much more involvement in government in healthcare, in universal healthcare, in single payer, or, as one Steph Sterling of the Roosevelt Institute, that tells you everything you need to know about this guy, suggests, what we really need is to nationalize our pharmaceutical industry. Because the fact is, our pharmaceutical industry does not have the incentives to make a virus, a vaccine. So we need government to make the vaccine. And by the way, that's true of many diseases. So we need government to take over the pharmaceutical company or to create its own pharmaceutical company to compete with the pharmaceutical companies. So you could see government involvement heavily involved in pharmaceutical development. By the way, how's that going in Europe or in other, I don't know if any countries tried it, and there's a reason they haven't tried it. Even the so-called socialist countries haven't tried it. Basically, almost all of the people on this argue that just like, they don't say this, but I will say it, just like every other crisis, the winner in this crisis is big government. Big government will come out of this victorious and ever bigger. They saved us because they quarantined us, because they locked us down. Rights? You care about rights, but we violated your rights and we saved you. We saved your life. Who cares about rights? Society is better off because government acted in a decisive, assertive way. So we will venerate government even more. Look, wow, they did it. And whether you want to venerate Trump or you want to venerate Cuomo or Newsom in California, it doesn't matter. The principle is going to be, government acted. And I think the death rate from this virus is going to be lower than the $100,000 that the government is, 100,000 people that the government is saying now. So they'll claim a success because they got a number significantly lower. And we will say, wow, we survived it. And of course, The stimulus package is going to reduce the pain. It's going to prevent a Great Depression. It will cause us to stagnate for decades, but that's unseen. We don't have a parallel universe where we acted differently. So that'll be taken as just the status quo. We already had that after 2008. It was just a death of growth. We'd reached our growth capacity. The economy couldn't grow more than it grew under Obama and under Trump. We had economists writing whole books, big books, arguing that growth was dead. We'd reached our max. So what we'll see is that people didn't starve in the street. What we'll see is that fewer businesses failed. What we'll see is airlines getting a bailout and they'll be up in the sky again. And what we'll internalize is, government can save us. Government can manage the economy. Government can protect us from disaster. Government spending stimulates. We don't have an alternative universe where this didn't happen. We don't have an alternative universe where the U.S. economy grows at 4% instead of 0%, and to see the differences in quality and standard of living that results in. So I see nothing positive coming out of this, politically, economically. Maybe the only positive will be that the scientists are taking a little bit more seriously, the national security priorities shift, and now they shift towards planning for future pandemics. But that can also lead to a lot of negatives. For example, we can increase surveillance just like we did after 9/11. We can have bio-trackers implanted under our skin to determine when we have a fever, when we've been exposed to a virus. All kinds of things that technology allows governments to do today to violate our privacy. We can be harassed much more about the countries we visit, the places we go to, the people we interact with, all in the name of protecting us from the next pandemic. So having pandemics taken more seriously can inevitably have negative implications if we're not careful. And we're not. We're showing no sign of actually being careful. So, again, I really see no positives. Another negative. If we do take the pandemic seriously and we have more pandemic planning, will we then start restricting trade in significant ways? Will we then believe that we have to build some kind of arsenal of protective gear, some kind of supply chain that's all internal to the United States, and eliminate global supply chains, and eliminate our ability to trade globally, all in the name now of national security? And you can imagine that a president like Trump certainly would jump on that. Wow, okay, my computer's behaving weird. All right, we'll manage. So I worry that the more we take corona or future pandemics more seriously, the more we restrict freedom in the present. All right, let me take a few of these questions that David sent together with the idea of the show. Will Americans demand a more authoritarian government to protect them? Or, if the lockdown is deemed as hindsight to be overreaction, will Americans want less government interference? Who is going to deem the lockdown overreaction? If fewer people die, then it'll be proof that it was just the right reaction. It won't be deemed as overreaction. Some of us will say it's overreaction. Some of us will complain bitterly. But the dominant view out there, I mean, Donald Trump has some of his highest approval ratings ever during this coronavirus, where he's behaved and functioned in some of the most incompetent way possible. And yet the American people don't care. So why should we assume that they are wondering? Como, people love the governors. All the governors have done phenomenally well in terms of ratings. Flatten the curve does reduce overall deaths because by flattening the curve, you allow hospitals to actually treat people. So flattening the curve absolutely is supposed to reduce the total overall deaths because now people can be treated, whereas if you overload emergency rooms, people die that don't need to die. They die because you can't treat them. You've overloaded the emergency rooms. So let's be clear on what flattening the curve actually does. Sure, it reduces deaths. That's exactly why it was instituted, to reduce loads in hospitals so they could treat people. There's no metric by which, again, there's no parallel universe other than Sweden, and people will make 1,000 different excuses on why Sweden, will see if it works better than the United States. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of Americans demanding less government interference out of this crisis. And again, there are very few crises in American history that I know of where the outcome was less government interference. So yes, I think the demand for more authoritarian government to protect them is going to increase. I think more government in healthcare, more government in pharmaceuticals, more government in monitoring us to make sure we don't bring in a virus, more government interference in trade, all of those, I think, are going to become realities as we move into the future. Will there be long-term resentment of government for destroying jobs, wealth, and business? No. I think it will be pitched like it always is. Is there long-term resentment of government destroying the lives of soldiers and Marines, of families, of children, of wives? Send them to die for nothing in Afghanistan. A war that everybody agrees has been a failure. Everybody agrees has meant nothing, has done nothing, has succeeded in nothing. Is there long-term resentment of government for the deaths of thousands of American kids? You'd think that would outrage us. I did a show here on the whole revelations of the fact that the government knew that that Afghanistan was not working, and they kept sending more troops and more money and more lives wasted. And nobody watched the show, nobody cared, nobody shared it. There was no outrage. The story that broke by the Washington Post, nobody picked it up. It lasted for a few days and then disappeared. It was the biggest story up to that point of the last maybe 5 years, 10 years, in terms of gross government incompetence. And at the price of our children. Price of our children. And that was real journalism. That was real journalism. That was an amazing, amazing piece of journalism. And the American people just didn't care. Afghanistan, it's in the background over there. Somebody else's children are dying. Yeah, the American kids. Yeah, maybe there's something good about it. Trump said we should increase the troops there, and one day he'll bring the troops back, and he's signing a peace deal. I trust Trump, so who cares? Or I trust Obama. Obama did the same thing. Increased the troop, promised to bring them back, didn't bring them back. I trust Obama, that's okay. I mean, I don't understand where any of you have any kind of optimism about government and not about government, about the American people today. I mean, I wish they were different. I don't think the American people of 50, 60 years ago would tolerate this. I don't think that, well, they did. They tolerated Vietnam. But at least there were demonstrations in the street during Vietnam. At least there was a leftist opposition. There's been no opposition to Afghanistan. And when the papers, what they called the Pentagon Papers came out, it was an uproar. It was massive. The thing that the Washington Post revealed was the equivalent of the Pentagon Papers, and nobody cared. I mean, what we care about is thinking, are we going to build a wall or not? Kids, our kids dying overseas? Who cares? They're not my kids. Ooh, I'm negative today. But that's, you asked, a negative topic. What can I say? So I don't see where anybody would think this is no reaction. I don't see where the resentment will come from. Yeah, some people resented. There'll be obviously some who did lose their jobs, who did lose their work, but many people just say, well, that's life. And thank God for the government, we didn't lose more. Will less Americans want to live in cities? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think the benefit of living in cities is so significant and so substantial. And the death rate is not going to be that massive. That there's the inconvenience of the lockdowns, obviously. I just don't think it's going to change that much in terms of willingness to live in cities. There's just too much of an upside. Now, I do think we will be doing more online. We're engaging in more online activities. So I think there'll be more working at home. There'll be less commuting. I do think at the margin, there are going to be impacts like that. But I don't think it'll be on the scale of not living in a city. Will urban dwellers go back to sitting in parked subway cars and buses? Yes. What choice do they have? Most of the people in subway cars and buses in many cities are people who can't afford a car, people that can't afford to live inside the city, and you need the job. And it's the easiest, cheapest, quickest way to get back and forth. So I don't see the option. Now, again, maybe subways, cars, and buses will be less packed because there'll be more working from home. So I think, working at a distance, fewer meetings, less travel in airplanes because you can do more on Zoom. I think people will become accustomed to kind of Zoom communication and things like that will make it more possible for them to, not engage in some of these behaviors. So behavior at that level will change. We will be much more tech savvy. I know a lot of people who've never done Zoom, never done video conferencing, now learning how to do it and getting excited about it. Will Americans want to venture into packed airline cabins? I think they will, although again, I think there might be a decline in air travel, not because people are afraid of the airline cabin, but because they'll discover the convenience and the efficiency of doing meetings via video. There's a sense in which I can't wait to get back into an airplane, get back to normal, get back to traveling, get back to seeing people face to face. I far prefer that than video, but that's me. Will Americans go back to their restaurants and entertainment venues? I think so. Quickly. I think that'll recover very quickly. Very quickly. I actually don't think Americans are that scared of the virus. I think they're scared of what they're being told about the virus. They're scared about, I think there's a lot of fear-mongering going on that scares them, but I think they'll overcome the fear itself. Just like after 9/11, we all went back into that skyscrapers. Nobody stopped going into skyscrapers. Nobody stopped building them other than for regulatory reasons, and nobody stopped renting places at the top of skyscrapers. And very quickly, we returned to stuff like that. We turned to airplanes. You remember how scary it was to fly? You didn't know what was going to happen. You looked suspiciously at everybody around you. When it went away pretty quickly. All right, guys, I'm going to ask you to stop on the Super Chat questions just because we have a lot of them. We had a lot of them, and I'm not going to be able to get to all of them given all of this. Okay, will indoor sports and music venues be shunned? No, I don't think so. Again, we'll get back to them very quickly. Will some parents embrace online learning and reject traditional schools? Some. I think a small number. Same with, again, online education I think will thrive. I think a lot of students are going to realize, university students, they don't have to go to class. A lot of professors will like teaching off of a computer. They'll get used to it. A lot of people are doing it for the very first time. And if they do it for a whole semester and they like it, so you'll see a lot more online education, a lot more homeschooling, a lot more meetings, this kind of meetings. So less flying, less commuting, but not because people fear flying or fear commuting, but because of the convenience that they will have discovered exists through these mediums. But I think the fear factor will go away just as it went away very quickly after 9/11. All right. Those are my answers to David's questions. Let's see if there are other America 2.0 questions in the Super Chat quickly, and then I'll take general questions. What do you, disagreement? For more elaboration on concept. Okay, I think as soon as society reopens, won't there be more cases and death? Will the essential choice come down to accepting that outcome or accept being locked down? Yeah, I mean, I think there will be. It depends exactly when the lockdown ends, depends on whether we've developed herd immunity or not, depending on whether there's a vaccine. But certainly before there's a vaccine, you can expect more deaths. Now, whether those deaths will accelerate, I think we're going to have to keep some form of social distancing for a long time, hopefully through testing, massive testing, and through isolating people who have it and isolating the vulnerable, we can reopen society and go back to normal without a huge spike in deaths. But that is the risk. That's why I don't know when this isolation goes away, and I don't know how they undo what they have done. It's very, 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 very difficult to figure out. And this is what Amesh has been saying, Amesh Adolja, that, in the fall it's going to come back. We might get a reprieve in the summer, maybe not. But if we get a reprieve in the summer, it comes back in the fall. Then what? So this virus situation is very complex, and when you don't do the right things, which this administration has not done, and the states have not done to a large extent because of lack of testing, it leaves you with a lot of bad options and very few good options. What we should be doing right now is ramping up to millions and millions of tests, and then lots and lots of serum tests that can give us a sense of what percentage, and we should do those randomized, what sense the population has immunity. So how many people have actually got the virus, got the antibodies for the virus? That should be the next big step. Massive numbers of randomized serum tests for antibodies that will test us in different localities. How many people do we estimate have the virus? They need to be representative of the population, and the tests need to be random and representative. And anyway, there's a whole science to doing this, which I'm not an expert in. But if we could get that, then we'd have a much better sense of when to open, how to open, what are the chances of recurrence, and so on. All right, let's see. There was a question here about statistics. Yes. Dr. Peikoff wrote, statistics are applicable only when, 1, you're unavoidably ignorant about giving out concrete. 2, some action is necessary and cannot be deferred. Can you relate this to your use of stats? Read the virus. Absolutely. Here's the issue about what you mean by statistics. Because in other sections of OPAR, he writes, or in his discussion of epistemology somewhere, he talks about probability. He talks about having likely, probable, unlikely, or almost impossible to happen. And that's what probabilities are. That's what probabilities give you. They give you that kind of sense, which you have to have about future action, where there is no certainty. So you would have to look carefully at what he actually means by statistics in this context, and how that relates to what I'm talking about in terms of probability of death. And Leonard actually uses the probability of getting in a car accident is basically zero, and therefore it doesn't worry you. But if the probability is high that something's going to happen, that is unbelievably relevant. So, 2, some action is necessary, cannot be deferred. Absolutely. You have to figure out whether you're going to go outside, whether you're going to interact with other people, whether you're going to wear a mask. And you don't have certainty about the outcome. That is, you don't have enough information to be certain. So, for example, if I knew that I had antibodies, then I would be certain that I wouldn't get infected, even if I went up and interacted with somebody who did have the coronavirus. And therefore, the probabilities wouldn't matter. But I don't have full knowledge of my situation vis-a-vis the virus. I don't have full knowledge on how the virus is going to affect me specifically, what the causal connection is going to be. And therefore, all I have are the probabilities. Now, the closer you can get to certainty about an outcome, the better it is. But I can't wait for certainty. I have to act. That's Dr. Peikoff's point number 2. So I think it's really, really important to understand probabilities, to understand what probabilities imply, and to integrate it into your thinking. Not past statistics, but what is the probability of me? How does all these statistics apply to me? What's the probability of me getting hurt under these circumstances? And I have to act. I have to go out and get the groceries. And I don't have full information. And I can't get full information. That's the ignorance. So I think it's consistent. Of course, if Leonard were here, he might tell me I'm full of it and explain to me why I'm wrong, but he's not here. So I wish he was. I actually like it when people tell me, people I respect, and people who actually know something, tell me, which Leonard certainly has told me many times in my life. Leonard Peikoff has told me many, many times in my life that I'm wrong, that I'm full of it, that I'm doing something wrong, thinking about something wrong, approaching something wrong, and it's been amazing. I love it. Uncle Gate has told me that on several times, many times, over the last 20 years. But Leonard, more than anybody, I've learned more from Leonard telling me I'm wrong than almost from anything else. There are very few people who, I wish there were more people who could do that for me. It's a great gift when somebody tells you you're wrong and shows you why and explains how you could do it better. That is an amazing gift. All right. What has Dr. Fauci done right? What has he done wrong? Can you grade his performance in handling the coronavirus? I don't know. I don't know well enough. He's in a very difficult situation. He's dealing with Donald Trump. He works for Donald Trump. Now, that is an impossible situation to be in as a scientist or a man of any reason. And I have a huge amount of respect for him. He's one of the few people ever who have actually in public stood up to Donald Trump, have said he disagrees, have provided alternatives. So I have a massive amount of respect for Fauci just for that. Most other people who thought Donald Trump was wrong got fired, got eliminated. Trump can't afford to fire him. Now, I think he's toast once this crisis ends. Once Trump doesn't need him, and he can't be perceived as dismissing him because he disagrees. So after this crisis, he's definitely going to be fired. But for now, Trump needs him. He gives him a facade of credibility. because he's a doctor and he seems to tell the truth. But beyond that, I just don't know. Clearly, he was pretty nonchalant about the threat early on in January when other people thought we should do more. He seems to be willing to call it like it is, or at least like he sees it. I'm not sure he's right. I'm not sure he has the data. I'm not sure he thinks about these issues properly in the sense of what are the alternatives. He's one of these guys, he's a doctor. And like most doctors, not all, Amesh Adalja is an example of a different type of doctor. He thinks the only thing that matters is saving lives. So if we have to lock down everybody, we have to lock down everybody. That's all that matters. And he jumps on that. So I don't think he's right on that. I haven't seen him present alternatives and be nuanced. So I think his virtue is that he stands up to Trump and he seems to speak his mind. But we don't know because we don't know to what extent he's muzzling himself because of Trump. Hard to tell. So I don't know. I'm skeptical about Fauci because he's been in a government job for so long. I'm skeptical of anybody who holds a government job for a long time, including our military. I'm skeptical of anybody in the generals in the military. Because after you've been in the government for a long time, the kind of government we have, not every government, not an ideal government, but the kind of government we have, there's no way not to be corrupted. Do you think most people never experience happiness and have no real concept of what that is? Yes, I do think most people don't experience happiness. They might glimpse it in certain periods of their time. You know, the star quarterback in that final year of high school when just clicking and everything's going, and this was his value. This is what he wanted to do. He's achieved it. He's done it. He wins the title. He gets the girl. Everything is just going his way. But for somebody to sustain that over a lifetime, I just don't think that's the case. Again, I think people could be happy for periods in their life when things are going well, where you know they are oriented towards the rational in their life, towards rational activities, towards using their mind, and things are just going well, particularly in their career. So I think people experience it, but for short periods of time. They don't experience it through a lifetime. Very few people I know are happy, just generally happy in their life. If someone disrespects you and you want to hurt them physically, does that mean you have low self-esteem? No, not necessarily. It depends on what you mean by want to hurt them physically. And it depends on what they did to disrespect you. If they just disrespected you, minor thing, then yeah. But if somebody worked to destroy you, if you had an enemy, I've had people like that, still have. People who systematically work to destroy you, then yeah, having ill feelings towards them is appropriate. They're your enemy. Hate is a necessary and appropriate emotion towards people who are your enemies, who are seeking to destroy you. But if somebody just disses you in a conversation, then wanting to hurt them or getting all insulted and getting all, yeah, I mean, I think that does show low self-esteem because you're letting them dictate. Now, you could say, I never want to talk to that person again. I don't like that person, but that's it. Walk away, and that's done. But to actually want to engage in attacking them for the sake of attacking them, like hurting them physically, I think is a sign of self-esteem, is a problem of self-esteem where it's a problem of second-handedness in a sense. You're letting them dictate the terms. You're letting them decide action for you. They're letting them dictate your life for you. You can get a spike of anger and then walk away. Again, now you want to hurt them physically. In the moment, you want to punch them, but you don't, and then you walk away and you forget about it, and it doesn't have any impact on your life. That's fine. I don't think the emotion of wanting to slap the person is a sign of low self-esteem. I think it's holding that and making that a part of you and letting it dominate you and engaging, either slapping them or getting upset immediately with them and engaging with them, or keeping it and keeping you upset is a sign of low self-esteem. Do you think there will be any positive outcomes, economic outcomes? No. No, I can't imagine what they will be. What could be any positive economic outcome? I mean, some people will make money off of this crisis. I intend to try to make money off of this crisis by buying really cheap assets and making gazillions of dollars when they go up. I think crises like this create lots of misallocation and dislocations in financial and economic markets that investors can take advantage of and make a lot of money. But that's not a positive economic outcome qua economy. I don't think you could have a positive economic outcome given the virus, given the response of government, and given the massive stimulus and the Fed action. If Leonard Peikoff's book, Disintegration, Integration, Misintegration, is true, is it immoral to have children given that we'll be living under dictatorship in the next few decades? I mean, that's a good question, a difficult question to answer, partially because Leonard has leaves an opening for a positive outcome in the end. It's not certain. I mean, talk about probabilistic thinking, right? Leonard says it's highly likely that his prediction will happen, but it's not certain that his prediction will happen. That's probability. It's not putting a number to it, but it's a probability estimate about the future. Going back to our discussion earlier. You have to put a probability over that. Then you have to assess how much joy you will get out of having kids. And then you have to assess over their lifetime what you think will happen. There's always the possibility of a positive outcome. I think one attitude, so you have to figure that out. But if there was certainty, then that's a really tough decision that you would have to make. And you would definitely have to take into account the idea that you're bringing children into a world that is likely to be authoritarian. And then you have to assess based on it'd be interesting to talk to maybe Greg Sullivan next time he's on and ask him the question, because he just had a baby. And it'd be interesting to ask him about that and to ask, I think, other young people who are thoughtful about these things, who have just had babies, about their thoughts. And I think a lot of people are more optimistic than Leonard is. That's partially why people have babies. Why do you think there's such disagreement about the lockdown among objectivist thinkers? I don't think there's much disagreement about the lockdown among objectivist thinkers. There's some, and there's some disagreement among objectivists. So I don't know what you mean by objectivist thinkers, but I don't think there's a huge amount. I think the general consensus is that there was a massive failure early on of testing and isolating, like the South Korea model, that by the time we got to a few weeks ago, it was too late for that, and that something had to be done, and that some lockdowns, some sense of lockdowns might have been appropriate in certain places. I don't know of any objectivist thinkers who think it was okay to lock down most of the U.S. I don't know of many objectivist thinkers that think that the extent of the lockdowns are justified. I'm not saying all. There's some people who think that. And I don't know anybody, I think, who thinks that the lockdowns were inevitable if the government had done the right thing at the right time. So I don't know that there's a lot of disagreement. I don't encounter, among objectivist thinkers, I encounter a lot of disagreement on Facebook, but they're mostly not objectivists, and most of them are not thinkers. But again, I'm not saying there's no disagreement. There is. And partially it's an assessment of the threat, the level of the threat, its ability to do this kind of probabilistic thinking I was talking about, the availability, the ability to think about data properly, but also assessment of what would have happened if the government had done the right thing. But I don't think the lockdowns are necessary. I think voluntary action would have been better. But I do think you can imagine a situation where they have failed so badly where it might have been appropriate in New York, because hospitals in New York were going to get overrun. And so you can imagine that a lockdown for a particular specific pre-specified period of time was necessary in New York City. But I don't think it's necessary all over the country. You have to assess it location by location. And based on the data, based on the hospital beds, based on ventilators, based on the number of doctors, and based on what actions have already been taken. Right? But that's only, and they're only, okay, because government has failed and because we live in a mixed economy. In a pure capitalist economy, lockdowns would be very, very rare under extreme emergency situations and very short term. I gave an example of an appropriate lockdown, a terrorist attack in your neighborhood. The government appropriately could lock down the neighborhood while it dealt with it. But it has to be constrained, finite, and it has to be clear why and what the actions necessary that are going to be taken to get you out of it. So again, I think at some point New York put itself in a position where it had no choice. But there were plenty of choices earlier on. If they had ramped up testing, isolating, tracking, testing, tracking, isolating. I've been promoting that for 2 months. How would the U.S. deal with China? How should the U.S. deal with China? I mean, what is the U.S.? Again, I don't think China is an enemy, but it is a dictatorship. So I think the United States should have no embassy in China. It should have no diplomatic relations with China. I think the United States should use the moral bully pulpit to condemn China's actions that violate individual rights. But with regard to trade, it should be up to every individual to decide whether they want to trade with China or not. You need to be able to go into a store, look at a product and say made in China and decide, I don't want it. And if enough of us don't buy a certain product from China, then other producers will make it, or they'll shift production to Vietnam, or they'll shift production to Mexico, or maybe the US. So the moral decision about trading with China, see, countries don't trade. You trade when you buy something made somewhere else. That needs to be an individual decision unless the other country is deemed an enemy. Only enemies, that is, countries that constitute a military threat to the United States, only countries like that, you should embargo. And then it's not a matter of tariffs, and it's not a matter of penalizing. It's a matter of you don't trade with them, like we do with North Korea, or like we do with Iran. So enemy countries, we should have zero trade with, no relations with. Immoral countries, countries that have authoritarian regimes, we should have no diplomatic relations with, no embassies, no government relations, other than when you have to. Right? And then trade should be left to individuals. And again, the American government should use its leadership position to convey its views about the evil of a particular regime. And that's how I think we should trade. I've never claimed that we should have diplomatic relations with China. I've never claimed they were a good regime. I, for a long time, thought they were heading in the right direction and wanted to encourage that direction. But they reversed course a few years ago with this latest president. They reversed course away from freedom towards more authoritarianism, and that needs to be condemned. And, for example, putting pressure on them in a variety of different ways to stop allowing, like, wet markets, if wet markets really do dramatically raise the risk of pandemics, is something we should do. How you exactly do that? Not through trade, not through tariffs. Tariffs are a stupid way of dealing with it because you're penalizing yourself. How can you tell the difference between a man who is a statist because he thinks it's right and a man who is a statist because he knows it is wrong? Well, how they deal with facts when you present them to them. Somebody who you present facts to and causes them to think and maybe challenges them, and another one will just reject it. They don't want to hear the facts. They're not interested in facts, and that is an evader, and therefore somebody who is immoral in his statism. So the issue is the evasion. It's not that they know they're wrong. It's not like people walk around saying, I know statism is wrong, but I'm going to be one anyway. No, it's they know status is wrong is over there, and they never look over there. It's in a part of their consciousness. It's definitely in their mind. But they don't look there, they don't examine it. And when you present them with a fact that would force them to go to that place in their mind, they attack you, they condemn you, they don't look at the fact, they don't want to examine the fact because that would force them to the realization that everything they believe is wrong. 1 trillion is pocket change these days. It will either buy you a war in the Middle East or 2 green candles. It's my 20th birthday today. Happy birthday. Sorry you feel that way about $1 trillion. It sure seems like a lot of money for me. To me, I'd love to have, a slight fraction of $1 trillion. For more elaboration on the concept of an alternative universe, yes, in which X didn't happen, see Henry Hazlitt's Economic in One Lesson. You can get it, by the way, free. You can download it for free. So absolutely, the best introductory book on economics, and one that emphasizes how difficult it is for our side to win because we don't have a parallel universe where we run laissez-faire capitalism. The best book on that is Hazlitt's Economic in One Lesson. Kant used the D2 to destroy the I in order to save the M2 now rising, to save us from the M2 now rising, I assume. In order to save the M2 now rising. Once the M2 gets too bad, did people use D2 to destroy the M2? And then, tired of it all, embrace the I for a change? Or will there be a Buddhism next? If you look at history, M2 gets destroyed by I, by an effort at I. An effort at I doesn't always succeed. D2 is basically ultimately destroyed by the I of the Enlightenment. The I of the Renaissance, but really the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. That's an I. It's one of the few I periods in human history. So an I is what destroys the M2. Now, if you look at M2s like communism and fascism, they don't get destroyed by D2s. They get destroyed by D1s. They get destroyed by, by people who want to be freer. People who don't believe that all this really integrates in that silly way. So D1 can destroy M2. It did in the Soviet Union. It did in Europe. The left seems to think Trump wants more suffering instead of just being incompetent. I think this is a projection of how their true nature. Yeah, I think that's right. I think they view everything as political and they reflect that on Trump. I think Trump's main problem is that he just doesn't care and he's just incompetent. I don't think he cares about suffering one way or the other. It's not that he wants more. I just don't think he cares. I